Today's News Talk Radio.
Now we're talking.
TNT.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to TNT, Today's News Talk. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. We're still in hour number one of this live broadcast. Thank you very much to our TNT chat community. I see the people moving into the chat room there. That's the red bubble in your lower right-hand corner. Go to tntradio.live. You'll see that community there. That's where you want to be during the live broadcast. Appreciate you guys. Listen, we're going to change gears a little bit. We're going to take a more broader view here of the Middle East, of what's going on in the Eurasian zone as well. And we're going to be talking to a fantastic geopolitical analyst, author, and great political commentator, Glenn Diesen, joining us right now from Norway. Glenn, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Glenn, there's a lot of things we want to try to cover here. I'm going to recommend that people follow your X Twitter feed because it is a great source of information and timely commentary on all the breaking news and the important issues that are going on internationally. Glenn, now my view of you, Glenn, over the years has been a lot of it has been, Ukraine, Russia, European geopolitics. You've also pivoted to the Middle East in the last 3 or 4 months because of what's happening. And a lot of us have had to pivot to this region as well. And we haven't spoke about this yet, but just give us your observations and your kind of feelings and thoughts over what has transpired in Palestine, Israel, since October 7th. Just lay that out for us, and then we'll move into other areas. But go ahead.
Well, I think what happened in Israel and Palestine is quite significant because at the moment, I don't think we can go back to the way things were. And of course, this was never really a sustainable situation either because, for how would you organize this region, if only about half the population are Jewish? I mean, the main problem is, if you accept a two-state solution, then of course you can give a national state to both Israel and the Palestinians, one state each. But given that Israel sabotaged the two-state solution for so long, there was not really any solutions. I mean, they tried to run it under occupation and as an apartheid system. But given that this hasn't been working, I think now they have gone in for ethnic cleansing instead. And some might even say genocide. And I think that this is not accidental. I think that this is simply the only solution they have left, because if you don't have two states, you don't want to live in the same state together, because, well, then it wouldn't be a Jewish nation state. What else is there except apartheid or cleansing the region of the Palestinians? So I think that it has gone to such a great length now that there's no way going back anymore. And I guess what's frightening here is that there doesn't seem to be a proper solution to this conflict either.
Glenn, in the past we've seen Israel with the heavy hand in Gaza previously, in various other operations, 2014, 2012, 2008, and always, not just in Gaza but elsewhere, but always the United States or the international community would kind of come in to restrain Israel at some point. They'd say, look, that's enough. We need to, dial this back a little bit. It appear to be coming back to some kind of at least talks or something like this. In this case, Glenn, none of those calls for restraint happened. In fact, it was the opposite. The EU weighed in, total support from day one, the United States, Britain, other countries. To me, this is a big sea change in how the West and the Western powers are, treating this region. Why has this happened? And what does this say about the changes in the geopolitical landscape?
Well, it's a good question because obviously the United States has always been very supportive of Israel. But at the end of the day, as they do with all of their allies, they look after America first. So, to what extent it is in the U.S. national interest. But in this instance, it seems like this is going very much against American interest. as they need to preserve their relations with all of the other countries in the neighborhood, from Turkey to Egypt. So the Americans are alienating a lot of states in the region. And even it will go against what America claims to be its policies, because the U.S. claims to support the two-state solution. However, they're effectively funding this war against the Palestinians and assisting Israel in denying a two-state solution. And they also say that they want Israel to be more cautious, more careful about the collateral damage against the civilian population, or at least not targeted directly. And this really does it anyway. So, but America is the one who enables it. So it's quite strange to see the United States in this respect go against its own interests. And it's one can point to the particularities of this government. Perhaps some would point to the strong Israeli lobby in the United States. Others would maybe look at how this began, or how it evolved, because I think many of us were quite shocked on the 7th of October when Hamas attacked, given not that they would attack, as it's quite reasonable for them to resist, but the attacks on the civilian population. So I think the first impulse, much like the Europeans, it was to pledge their full loyalty to Hamas. No, sorry, to Israel, saying that this was unprovoked. We fully support Israel, and then kind of Israel ran with this and began to effectively now carrying out the genocide. And I think it's difficult to walk back this support. I think the Europeans have been more critical in voice, but beyond that, empty rhetoric, there's not much there. And the Americans, again, they seem to be defending Israel more than Israel is. At least the Israelis are recognizing what they're doing, but the Americans are seemingly providing a cover. So so I think it could be many different variables. I think for the Europeans, given that we're currently fighting a proxy war against the Russians, we become more dependent on the United States. So I guess Europeans are a bit cautious as well, not to alienate the Americans. So I don't think it will be only one specific reason, but a multitude. But I do definitely agree with you that this is something different. Remember back at Nixon, who made this argument, we can't always support Israel. Like, America has to come first. There is some common interest, a large common interest, but we can't sacrifice national interests for Israel. But that's exactly what they're doing at the moment.
I think you made a really good point there about Europe, because Europe is very important, as is, of course, the United Kingdom. It gives the appearance of a coalition or some kind of a consensus in the West on major foreign policy issues. But always in the past, there's always been European countries that have stood up for the Palestinian issue. And it was almost like you could just rely on that all the time. And Scandinavia as well, Norway, Sweden, have always been sort of somewhat removed from the American consensus enough to kind of interject and maybe try to balance out the conversation a little bit. But that is a big sea change, actually, because I think Ukraine has solidified that pro-U.S. Position on all of these issues. So I think you've touched on something really important there, Glenn. That really takes the situation out of balance, heavily balanced on the U.S. Vantage point on all geopolitical issues. But going forward, Glenn, what do you think about the European Union asserting itself? Immediately, Ursula von der Leyen flying to Tel Aviv. They're projecting the Israeli flag on the European Parliament. So this is kind of a new territory as well, because it means that individual EU countries, they don't really have an independent foreign policy. Or is that where Brussels wants to take things?
Well, the EU has also gone in a very different direction. So if you read, for example, the academic literature on the EU, or just look at any of the speeches of the European Union from the 1990s and 2000s, the main message they want to get across is there were a different kind of actor. There were civilian power, there were a normative power. They didn't engage in this traditional geopolitics. They would solve the world's problem through values and diplomacy. So, but von der Leyen, of course, she has made it clear that we need to have a geopolitical EU, and that's why I think that in this effort to make themselves a geopolitical actor, they're throwing away something very important, because now effectively the EU has made itself, I would say, make itself complicit in ethnic cleansing, and even genocide, because they're the one refusing to criticize Israel. They are, again, we're waving the Israeli flags. They, in some places, I think it was France, they banned pro-Palestinian protests. So they put their full weight behind it. So suddenly they went from being this normative actor to not just being a geopolitical actor, but being one who would now indirectly endorse ethnic cleansing. So it's quite extreme. And again, this didn't come out of nowhere. This is first their actions in Ukraine was quite interesting, because they used the money from the peace funds to send weapons. Meanwhile, from day one, Borrell and the rest of the EU elites said that this would be resolved on the battlefield. Nobody in almost 2 years now have asked to sit down with the Russians to even talk, to see if there's a diplomatic path. Instead, they're just going full in on this has to be war. It's solved on the battlefield, again, fighting with Ukrainians. And after that, of course, you go into the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where the entire Armenian population got cleansed from Nagorno-Karabakh. And again, very silent approval, I would say, given that this was seen as a way of pulling the Armenians away from Russia and this Eurasian Economic Union, and try to pull it into the Western sphere. So this new geopolitical EU is, I think, the effort to become something new, a powerful actor. They abandoned one of the strengths they actually did have.
And this is kind of a disturbing space that we're moving into in the West, Glenn, the transatlantic sort of zone, is that, as you said, preferring to settle it on the battlefield, giving an implicit green light to ethnic cleansing and genocide. You have, enemies, perceived enemies of the West, moving in lockstep. Is this a very dangerous time in history, Glenn? Because have there been times in history where you've had similar trends, similar things, phenomenons happening preceding major world wars or major conflagrations involving different nations? Is that the sort of thing that we need to be concerned about?
I think it's a very destabilizing or difficult time. Not just time, I think 2024 is going to be a very problematic year as well, because I think this year will be the year that Ukraine collapses, and also some regional war will probably spark now based on what's happening in Palestine and Israel. I think on the wider frame of things, I think it's a change of world order as well, because keep in mind that modern world order was based on a balance of power between sovereign equals. This was the basic idea ever since the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. But after the Cold War, we had a very unique position. We couldn't effectively restore another Rome, if you will, Pax Americana, or unipolarity, in which there's one center of power based on universal values. So this was what we also refer to as liberal hegemony. Americans were very explicit. This peace will be based on having one center of power, the Americans being all dominant, and its security document said, no other country can even aspire to rival us, and this will be the source of stability. And also, this will be a benign international system, and liberal democracy would be supreme. So this will be the source of peace. However, 30 years later, obviously, this hasn't worked. Very predictably, unipolarity ends because the power is transferred from the core to the periphery. The US depletes all its resources. Values such as democracy and human rights are not used to constrain anymore. Instead, we use these values to enable the use of force. So whenever we talk about democracy and human rights, that's usually when we load the bombers onto our planes. So this is this is now being more and more rejected. And what you see now is a multipolar international system already having emerged. So you're having new centers of power, China, Russia, many of these countries are now opposing the US. Even allies from Turkey to India are now saying, we want to be able to diversify our economic connectivity. We can't be too dependent on the West. Look what's happening in the Arab world, for example. And I think this is why it's so unstable, because the unipolarity is already gone, but the multipolarity hasn't really asserted itself. That is, the Americans are trying to pull back to unipolarity by defeating its strategic rivals. So defeating the Russians, defeating the Chinese, and while the rest of the world, I would say, outside of NATO, are trying to pull the world in a more multipolar framework. We see organized around institutions such as BRICS become less dependent on Western technologies, industries, transportation corridors, banks, currencies, and such. So I think that this is why there's effectively an absence of order at the moment, because we don't even agree on the basics, which is how states should engage with each other. What are the basic rules? What are the norms? So this is, I think, this is what would explain why the Americans are now going to war seemingly against both the Russians, Chinese, the Iranians, and God knows who else.
Now, you brought up an interesting point, Glenn, and from an American perspective, a lot of people here will view U.S. power, U.S. hegemony, U.S. dominance, normally in terms of their military power and their financial muscle. And that's a sense of pride and this realization that they have this power, military and financial power. But what you're talking about there, historically, how empires are able to exist, or unipolar hegemons able to exist, need to have other countries rally around them in support of these universal values you're talking about. So isn't that where the United States is losing its footing in becoming a declining hegemon, in that it's abandoned at least the perception of these universal values? In other words, the U.S. can no longer be seen as an honest broker, even on the surface. I know the world is not perfect, and I think a lot of Americans have not picked up on this, and some have, but many haven't. And they don't realize, I don't know, is it true that maybe that is a more crucial source of legitimacy and power, as much, or in sometimes even greater than military or financial might? But what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, sure, because hegemon or empire, it tends to drain on the resources of the hegemon over time. Now, this can, of course, be in terms of treasury, it's economics, which the US definitely has suffered, but it can also be in terms of legitimacy, because look at the standing of the United States in the world. It is dropping, and this is, again, this is why it's also a shame for the United States that this is happening. Because just a quick detour, we often tend to think in being pro-American, anti-American, but the argument should be, why would this be good for the United States? It's depleting its resources. Its main rivals are now collectively balancing the United States. I mean, look at all these countries coming together to balance the Americans. They would, if the United States didn't demand a dominant position in the international system, they would probably be balancing each other to a greater extent. So it's and meanwhile, the Americans are losing legitimacy, economic might, military might, and they're realizing they're spending more money on military security. Meanwhile, they're getting less influence and more hostile pushback by their adversaries. So I think that all of this is very counterproductive, and the legitimacy is something also not just of the US ruling, but the entire rules of the international system. Because keep in mind, when international law under the UN Charter came in place after the Second World War, there's a balance of power, and international law tends to be a reflection of this international distribution of power. Now, when you have a multipolar system, or at least then bipolar, both sides agree to an international system based on sovereign equality. That is, you give up some flexibility in your foreign policy in return for predictability. So you have mutual constraints. That is what is defining international law. Now, after the Cold War, this unipolarity. Now, why would the hegemon want to constrain itself? It doesn't make any sense. So you begin then to, not you, sorry, but the hegemon would then begin to introduce new principles in international law, which reduces constraints on yourself without reducing constraints on the other. So what is done? You introduce ideas such as, humanitarian interventionism. We can interfere in your domestic affairs, but not the other way around. Democracy promotion. We can interfere in your election process, but you can't do the other way around. So you see all of this. It goes under humanitarian law, and this is also what we refer to now as the rules-based international order, which is democracy promotion, promoting human rights. All of this allows the US and NATO to undermine the sovereignty of other states, but it only goes one way. So the problem is whenever you have a question, let's say, if a country wants to, or region wants to secede from another one, be it, Kosovo, Crimea, Taiwan, under international law, we have the principle of territorial integrity. But then we introduce, this new idea of, self-determination under humanitarian law. And now we have two competing principles. So which one do we pick? This is the rules-based international order, because the US will always pick the one in its power interests, but it will refer to liberal values. So, for example, in Kosovo, yes, we do self-determination. So they secede against, we ignore international law. In Crimea, no, then they have to stay within Ukraine. And, it's you just pick and choose principles based on what serves power interests. So suddenly liberal democratic values goes from being this, values of, pacifying governance, more peaceful form of government, to becoming effectively something that enables empire, enables hegemony, enables one central power to rule over the rest by claiming full sovereignty for itself and reduced sovereignty for the rest. So I think that this is why the legitimacy of the entire international order, which the US has built up around it over the past 30 years, is now collapsing, because the relative economic strength going, the military strength, the legitimacy, so across the board. So the question for the United States should really be, does it want to facilitate a multipolar system now, which it has a privileged position, or does it want to reject it and push back? But then what it sees instead is the rest of the world trying to form it in opposition to the United States. So, Indians, Chinese, Russians, Iranians, Brazilians, all of them coming together simply to reduce dependence on the United States. So I think that this is the worst option for the United States. But again, in our simple-minded rhetoric, we call this anti-American, because, if you support America, you say, they just, fight this till the end. It's like supporting Israel, then you promote this suicidal policies, support Ukraine, fight to the last Ukrainian, no peace. This is the kind of logic we've been stuck in now with this very tribal thinking.
Yeah, and when the hegemon is declining, arguably it's the time when it needs as many allies as it can possibly marshal, not the other way around. But maybe that's just the nature of hegemons and empires. Before the break, you mentioned BRICS, the emergence of BRICS, and we also mentioned this important concept of universal values, or things that all countries can agree is right or wrong. South Africa has stepped forward, and I think this is kind of significant within this conversation here. They have been the one who stepped out first to invoke the Genocide Convention. A lot of other countries could have done it, Glenn. South Africa has done it. Why is this significant?
Well, it's quite important for a former apartheid state, of course, to do so, but also because they're part of the BRICS club, and also representing to some extent the Africans as well. Now, I think it's quite significant move, because it has a huge impact, I would say, in most places. Even in Israel, I see the Israeli media already responding to it. Only today I read in the Haaretz that, they call this should be an eye-opener, that, if Israel is associated now with genocide, this will be very, very destructive to its standing all over the world. And of course, it's something that worries the United States as well. as well, sitting over there, probably would be more familiar with, because this year will be elections in the U.S. From what I understand, some are trying to label the president, giving him nickname Genocide Joe. I think all of this, of course, is quite unfortunate to be associated with. So as soon as the genocide accusations move forward, I think it could be much more difficult to support. I mean, even the Europeans kind of were a little bit supportive of ethnic cleansing to some extent, because they try to sell it as, for example, to convince the Egyptians to take in Palestinians. If the Israeli bombed them out of their homes and pushed them south, the Europeans thought we can convince the Egyptians to take them in, which, but now we see, of course, this is not working out. If the alternative is become genocide, to kill them instead, then obviously, I think this label is something that's frightening many. So I think it's quite significant, but of course, it's also something that could blow over.
Yeah, so you can compare this scenario in terms of invoking the Genocide Convention. Previously, for Bosnia, this was also raised, and it seemed to get a result in Bosnia, although the circumstances were very different, because I think you had the United States backing that effort, if I'm not mistaken, to sort of place Slobodan Milosevic. This is during the breakup of Yugoslavia. Very different situation, two very different Genocide Convention incidents. And right now, do you see the potential for any European countries? Because South Africa has always been regarded like in an almost iconic fashion of Nelson Mandela is just this beacon of what's possible in the world, and it's like one of the last bastions of Africa breaking its colonial chains by removing the apartheid regime there. Can any European countries get behind South Africa and help to bolster their efforts here, or is this going to be a situation where they've been told don't go near it?
Yeah, well, I think you referenced Bosnia, because in Srebrenica there was, of course, the allegations of genocide against Bosnian Serbs. But in that instance, of course, the US and the NATO countries, we were the one bombing the Serbs. So, we put our adversaries, we accused our adversaries of genocide and put them to trial. So this, of course, was a way also to legitimize our own military intervention. So I think this is, of course, very different. And I would be more optimistic if this would have happened more than 2 years ago. But these days, I don't think the United States would support, obviously, any such proceedings against the Israel. And if the Americans goes against it, there's very little that the Europeans will do. I think at most the Europeans will have more critical rhetoric of Israel, kind of to try to be on the right side of history, if you will. But overall, they would be cautious to take any big actions against the United States wishes. So again, it's a very different situation these days for the Europeans. For just to point out, for so many years now, at least past decade, the Europeans was talking about European sovereignty, strategic autonomy, all these words which meant more autonomy or independence from the United States. And over the past 2 years, because of Ukraine, a lot of this completely collapsed. Obviously, at some point, this is going to have a lot of some repercussions, and others will come forward, which feels that they're being as Macron earlier said, become vassals of the Americans. But for the time being, I don't see the Europeans having much of an appetite for pursuing such steps, which is a shame. Which is interesting because, as you point out correctly, South Africa, given that South Africa comes forward with this, the country of Nelson Mandela, this is. It seems like something the Europeans would have supported before 2022.
Yeah, big shift again there. And I want to talk about Ukraine. But before we do that, there's another thing we've been discussing on this program with different guests. But this concept of the axis of resistance, you talk to an American or even your average European, they really don't have an idea of what this is. And recent events, we just saw the speech of Hassan Nasrallah just this morning and other addresses that he's made. Hezbollah as a, quote, non-state actor, a part of the axis of resistance, Ansar Allah, or the Houthis, as the West call them, from Yemen. These are factions or entities that are behaving with restraint, timing, reciprocity, almost like normative state actors. In fact, someone argued, Glenn, that some of the members of the axis of resistance are showing more normative traits in terms of statecraft than some of the great powers are on this. What are your thoughts on the axis of resistance? And I want to get a comment on Ukraine before we wrap up, but go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, no, I agree that they have been quite restrained through a lot of this, but also part of it is because they almost are state actors. I mean, if you look at the role of Hezbollah in Lebanon, they pretty much have become a state actor. Same as the Houthis in Yemen, they're pretty much they are the government, the leading government, at least in the Houthi areas. So yeah, they are, of course, taking greater risks, but at the same time, they're also showing some restraints in terms of, calculating what would be the Israeli retaliations.
Yeah, it is very interesting, especially the Yemenis' effort to disrupt Israeli shipping. Effectively, they're imposing sanctions on Israel, like the United States would do, and backing it up with hard power, and it's actually making a difference. Of all the international, the Arab countries could have done this, GCC countries could have done this, but none have. But Yemen has, of all countries, one of the poorest countries in the world on paper. So to me, this is historic, and I'm wondering if anybody will be joining in with them in due course or not. But even if they don't, they've already basically put themselves on the map as, you could say, Glenn, a force to be reckoned with in their backyard, in their neighborhood anyway. But very interesting development. On Ukraine, Glenn, things appear to be coming to a head. You alluded to this earlier in our discussion, that you think that 2024 is going to see a potential collapse in Ukraine as we once knew it. What do you see coming forward here? How is this going to transpire? What will happen to the Zelensky government? What will happen to the government, full stop, in Kiev right now? Go ahead.
Well, I think that it's reached the final chapter now. Well, the reason why this isn't becoming evident in the media is because the media has been quite dishonest about this. I think, because keep in mind that when the Russians first went in February of 2022, they had a very limited objective. They wanted to show military force in order to compel force the Ukrainians to implement effectively an edited version of the Minsk agreement, which the NATO countries undermined for 7 years. So and this worked. On the third day, they already agreed with the Ukrainians to have negotiations until they were sabotaged by the US and the UK. So this was initially the force they went in with, but it was a very small force. Barely. I think it was 100, 150. This was 1,000. This was all they went in with. So you can't conquer a country like Ukraine with this amount of forces. But that wasn't the purpose. But they didn't think that they would actually go to war fight with Russia. But again, that's what the UK and US promised them. We give you all the weapons in the world, but then the non-peace negotiation, then you just fight the Russians, bleed them. However, my point is that through 2022, the Russians began after the summer to get some real problems because, the West started pouring in weapons and Ukrainians showed that they were going to fight. So suddenly it was a miscalculation from the Russians. So they realized now that they would have to fight pretty much till the end. And this is when the war ended. Well, not ended, it changed, because then it became a war of attrition. Because the Ukrainians said we'll fight to the end. But for the Russians, they will also fight to the end because they can't simply pull out by comparison, this will be if the Chinese or the Russians established a military alliance with Mexico and started moving in their military hardware. Under no circumstance would this be acceptable, so to the US. And it's the same for the Russians. That doesn't legitimize anything. That's just the reality. So both sides will not fight till the end. So the Russians began then to do many things. They began to mobilize hundreds of thousands of troops. They began, putting on the economy on a war footing. They import weapons from allies. They begin to prepare a huge, massive army. They get all the drones they need, everything there is. And at the same time, the Ukrainians, they launched this offensive against well-fortified Russian defensive lines, in which they essentially lose all the equipment they got from the West. So what happened in 2023? The Ukrainians completely exhausted themselves, their military, everything. Meanwhile, the Russians built up this huge, powerful army, which now is ready to go on a full offensive. So again, if you look at people often look now at the map and hasn't moved much, but behind the map, you have to accept that this is a war of attrition. Usually, countries take territory after the adversary has been exhausted, and at the moment, the attrition rates are like 7 or 10 to 1. That is for each Russian, each Russian casualty, you're going to have 7 to 10 Ukrainians, and the reason is the Russians have many times more artillery equipment, ammunition. They dominate the sky through their air force, missiles, drones, their electronic warfare systems. So across the board, all their weapons, they completely dominate, and it only increases. And meanwhile, on the Ukrainian side, NATO says they don't have more shells to send. This is why America's sending cluster ammunition, because, as Biden said, we don't have anything else. And there's not much more to send. And the Ukrainians now has also run out of manpower. So now they're starting to send women into the trenches. More and more people are trying to flee the country. More and more are surrendering. And you can force people into the trenches, but then you're going to have more mutiny. You're going to have less motivated fighters. So overall, the situation seems to be deteriorating for the Ukrainians. And for those who have been following of the past week, the Russians began to launch a huge missile attack across Ukraine, essentially destroying all the factories, the different weapon depots, any storage facilities. So for me, it seems as if the Russians are preparing something very big. They see that the Ukraine has been completely worn down. On the Ukrainian side, the Russians have built up a huge force. I would expect that the Russians would start to go after territory at the moment. And again, their objective, how far will they go? Well, it depends a bit on NATO. Their main objective is they want to have neutrality for Ukraine. They don't want NATO to expand anymore towards their borders. If NATO comes forward and says, okay, we can accept a neutral Ukraine, then perhaps we can get a deal. But if like now, the NATO General Secretary, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, he argues, as soon as the war is over, Ukraine's going to join NATO. If this is what's going to happen, they're not going to allow cities such as Odessa to fall under NATO influence. So if this is the case, they're going to take Odessa too. They're going to take the entire Black Sea coast from the Ukrainians. Again, it's a horrible situation for the Ukrainians, but from the Russians' perspective, they're not going to accept having any of the strategic territories, either from military or economic perspective, end up in the hands of NATO. So it's I think it's going to be a very horrible year for Ukraine, and hopefully we would have some diplomacy, some statesmen coming forward, but I haven't seen any so far.
Yeah, well, I mean, Stoltenberg blowing that dog whistle for NATO is the one thing that's going to guarantee that Russia is not going to want to change its agenda, because if it knows that down the road that NATO is going to push forward with what their plans are, then how can they effectively get any dialogue going with Moscow? So it seems like there's no diplomacy at all. Quick, 1 minute, your final thoughts on that, Glenn.
No, I think this is what's been most disappointing for me, is the dishonesty around this whole thing. Because for the past 2 years, we said, no, this has nothing to do with NATO. This is just Russia wanting to reestablish empire. But it's been, for anyone who's been following this over the past 30 years, every American ambassador to Russia confirmed this is about NATO. Even Jens Stoltenberg himself said in September of 2023 that that the Russians they said they would invade unless they got a neutral Ukraine, and they said, "Oh, we're not going to do that." So it's just a lot of lying around this. This is the problem, because anyone who seemed to be able to understand and explain the Russians, they are then accused of legitimizing what they have done. So it's a lot of dishonesty and lying around around this conflict, which undermines our ability to resolve it.
No, very true. Very true. Look, this is developing. Glenn, we really appreciate your time today on TNT, Today's News Talk. Glenn Diesen, ladies and gentlemen, geopolitical analyst, author. Follow him on X, Twitter, one of the best accounts that you need to keep an eye on there. Glenn, we really appreciate you joining us this week.
Thanks again.
And there he goes, ladies and gentlemen. Glenn Diesen, we've tagged him on our posts on @21Wire on Twitter as well. Just click there, follow there. Top of the hour news headlines coming up. And on the other side, we've got breaking news updates from the Middle East. Plus, Jeffrey Epstein. We're going to go on the ground to the Southern District of New York Court. Matthew Lee has got new breaking news on the Epstein client list. That whole story, documents unsealed. It's all coming up in the next hour, folks. So stay right there. We'll be back in a few.